had to get it off my mind, as it has been chewing at me for months now. Though I'm not the best storyteller, I'll try to explain what happened. Thus, first some background. Living in this vintage house at 4217 Willow Creek Road in Glendale, Wisconsin, was my grandma Nadia. Mostly families and retirees. This is a quite peaceful area. Living there for as long as I can remember, Grandma Nadia was always quite proud of her garden. She spent hours every day caring to her flowers and plants, her pride and delight. Anyway, Grandma Nadia died last year. For all of us, it was difficult, however, for my mother especially. She worked hard and was quite close to her mother. We all visited Grandma's house following the burial to begin sorting through her belongings and deciding what to do with the space. I initially observed something odd in the garden at that point. I was spending a lot of time out there sorting Grandma's gardening tools and supplies since it was my responsibility. Everything originally appeared to be normal. Though little overgrown, that was to be expected from the garden. Grandma hadn't been able to take as much care as she once could have since she had been ill for some time before she went. Then, though, I came onto this strange plant in the rear corner of the garden as I was clearing some of the dead leaves and weeds. Unlike anything I had ever seen before, its long, twisting vines seemed to be moving on their own, and its sickly grayish-yellow leaves were, and something else about it too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It just felt incorrect somehow. When I asked my mother to have a look at it, she seemed not really bothered. She advised me to let it go, as it most likely simply some strange weed that had taken root. She basically blew me off when I tried to reason with her, telling her something was wrong about this plant. She seemed rather preoccupied with her personal loss to be truly attentive to what I was saying. So I let it pass. I reasoned perhaps I was simply seeing things that weren't actually there, acting in paranoia. I tried to forget the odd plant as I returned to tidy the garden, but I couldn't get rid of the impression that something was off during the next few days as we kept going through Grandma's possessions. I kept returning to the garden, back to that odd plant in the corner. And every time I studied it, it appeared to have slightly expanded. I started to feel as though my mind was failing. Though I knew a plant could not grow that rapidly, I couldn't ignore what I was personally witnessing. The vines looked to be strangling the other plants in the garden, getting longer and thicker as they reached out toward one another. When I tried to bring it up once more with my mother, she simply became irate. I was being foolish, she remarked, and plants don't grow that way overnight. She advised me to stop fixating over it and concentrate on housework. Still, I could not let it go. Seeking to identify the type of plant it might be, I began some internet research. Searching through gardening forums and plant identification websites for hours, I came nothing that fit the description of Grandma's garden. At last, hoping someone might be able to help me identify the plant, I decided to snap some photos of it and put them on a couple of the boards. Though I knew it was unlikely, I needed answers badly. A few days later, someone on one of the boards messaged me. It came from a person called Plantage42, who claimed to be a rare and exotic plant specialist botanist. Having seen my images, they expressed interest in the plant I had discovered. Plantage42 asked me all kinds of questions about the plant, where I had discovered it, how quickly it was growing, if I had noticed any unusual odors or sounds coming from it. We began texting back and forth. With each detail I offered, they appeared to get more and more enthralled. I told them everything I could remember. At last, following some days of back and forth, Plantage42 informed me they believed they identified the plant. Said to be an incredibly rare species, it had been believed to be extinct for more than a century. Their Latin translation of it, viridis mortis, was green death. Plantage 42 claims that some occult societies across history had employed the extremely deadly plant viridis mortis in their rituals and rites. They claimed that the plant could affect the minds of anybody who came into touch with it and had strong psychic ability. Though first dubious, the more Plantage 42 taught me about viridis mortis, the more I began to see they might be onto something. More I read, the more I felt like I was beginning to grasp what Grandma's garden was experiencing. They provided me old newspaper cuttings and diary entries detailing the plant and its claimed powers. Plantage 42 cautioned me against approaching the plant or allowing it to affect me in any capacity. If I wasn't careful, they warned, it may take over my thoughts and cause me to act in ways I would never otherwise do. Still, by then it was already too late. The plant had expanded to occupy over half of the garden, and its vines were beginning to slink toward the house's walls. Though I knew I ought to have notified my mother about what was happening, I couldn't seem to get myself to tell her. It seemed as though the plant was already calling to me from within my skull, urging silence. I began spending more and more time in the garden, just observing the plant as it developed. For hours I would sit there listening to the sound of its leaves rustling and feeling the warmth of its vines against my skin. It seemed as though it were calling me in. One night then something occurred that I cannot account for. As I had been doing every evening for weeks, I was seated in the garden when I heard a voice. I first assumed it was simply the breeze, but then I realized the plant itself was producing the sound. "Luca," it murmured, its voice like dry leaves flinging in the breeze. "Come forward." Though I knew I should have been terrified and should have fled, I couldn't seem to get moving. I felt as though the plant had me under its spell, as though I were in a trance. With hands and knees, I crawled forward until I was right near to the plant, my face just inches away from its writhing vines. Then one of the vines sprang out and encircled my wrist before I could respond. I yelled and tried to back off, but the vine grabbed tight. It felt me throbbing against my skin, as if it had an independent pulse. Then, horrified, I felt a stinging agony in my wrist as though something was burrowing into my flesh. Looking down, I discovered the vine had pierced my flesh and something dark and greasy was running from the incision up my arm and into my body. Once more I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. It felt as though the plant were within me, in charge. Everything afterward is a blur. I recall flashes of events. My mom's frightened expression upon seeing me passed out in the garden, the doctors at the hospital working to diagnose me, Plantage 42's frantic texts alerting me to flee the plant before it was too late. Still, it was too late. The plant had rooted itself inside me and was developing like cancer across my body. It was speaking to me, guiding me into terrible deeds. I won't dwell on the specifics of what followed. I want not to go through it again, and I want not to bother anyone else. Just know that thanks to what that plant forced me do, people suffered. It was all my fault. Right now I'm in a psychiatric hospital under continual observation. According to the physicians, I have some sort of insanity and my brain seems to be defective. Still, I know the truth. I know it's the plant. It's still within me, waiting for its opportunity to seize once more. How much more I can fight it? I'm not sure I sense it getting stronger every day, and its roots sinking farther into my psyche. I fear what I might do and of who I might damage. I am thus telling my tale now while still able to. I need someone to know the truth and help me to make sense of what transpired. And I have to tell you, every one of you, to avoid 4217 Willow Creek Road. Refrain from Grandma Nadia's garden. For something in there, something still developing, still waiting. And should it escape? If it does so, if it spreads, I desire not to consider what might transpire. Promise me, if you ever come across a plant like the one I have described with those long, twisting vines and sickening grey-green leaves, you will run, not turn around, run as far and as quickly as you can. Since viridis mortis is still a voracious parasite, and it won't stop until it's gone through everything in its path. My wife, Lena, and I settled into our new Akron, Ohio residence at 1742 Maple Street. At last, having our own property after years of renting made us very happy. Though it was ancient, built in the 1920s, the house had character, you know? Many wooden elements, a large porch, and even an attic. We were ready for the challenge, even though it needed some work. We paid a fair price for it. The first several months were excellent. We restored the kitchen, painted the walls, and began to personalize the space. Lena loved gardening, hence she worked on the backyard for a lot of hours. I concentrated on the inside and methodically updated each room. I made the decision one day it was time to look through the attic. We hadn't gone up there yet, and I thought it would be ideal for storage. The ingress came via a little door in our upstairs hallway's ceiling. Drawing down the foldable ladder, I ascended with a flashlight in hand. Like you might anticipate, the attic was dusty and covered in cobwebs. Stretching the entire home, it was larger than I had anticipated. I mentally noted several old boxes left by the previous owners to go through later. My flashlight beam caught something in the corner while I was scouting about. It appeared to be a little door, nearly concealed behind some vintage furniture. Intrigued, I went over and cleared the area of the items. It was a 3-foot-tall door, quite reasonable. I experimented with the handle, but it locked. That seemed odd. Why should our attic have a secured door? I returned downstairs and let Lena know. She possessed the same natural curiosity as I did. Maybe it's just an old storage space, she added. We ought to endeavor to open it. We searched the home for a key nowhere, so the following day I ordered an online lock-picking set. Though I had never chosen a lock before, I viewed some YouTube videos and worked with several antique padlocks we had on hand. I needed several days to get the hang of it. About a week later, at last, I felt prepared to test the attic door. Lena was at work, hence I was by myself in the house. Lock-picking tools in hand, I ascended to the attic and headed toward the little door. After over an hour, I at last heard that wonderful click. Turning the handle and dragging the door open, my heart was pounding. Perhaps 4 feet by 4 feet, the area behind the door was modest. Apart from one central cardboard box, it was empty. I moved the box into the more roomy main attic space. Not sealed, so I opened it not sure what to expect. Within was a stack of notebooks. The covers faded and the papers yellowed. They appeared old. I got the one on top and opened it. Evelyn Marsh was the name written on the first page. The date below it is 1954. I started reading and things got strange then. The notebook was a diary, and from the first entry I could tell Evelyn had lived in this house. She penned about her 2 children, her husband George, and her daily existence. But as I read on, I observed something unusual. She persisted in bringing up topics that defied logic for 1954. George got home one of those brand new iPhones today. Although he claims it will simplify his work, I have doubts about those things. If you ask me, too much technology is excessive. I blinked, convinced I had read it incorrectly, but no, it said quite precisely iPhone. Turning further pages, I came across more improbable references. She cited COVID-19, ordering from Amazon, and even Netflix. As I set down the first notebook and grabbed another, my hands shook. Though it was dated 1932, this one had an impossible blend of past and present. Harold, the author, talked of using his laptop while seated in his Model T Ford. I turned through every journal in the box. 12 in all, spanning 1925 to 1978 were there. Each one was bursting with these antiquated entries, fusing the past with the present and even the future in ways that just could not be genuine. Surrounded by these unworkable diaries, I sat in the dusty attic, trying to understand what I was reading. Was this kind of complex hoax? But for what reason? And how did they find our attic? I had to have been up there for hours since Lena called my name from downstairs just then. I closed the little door and rapidly pushed the notebooks back into the box. Though I had no idea why, I felt I should keep this a secret, at least until I worked out what was going on. I found myself in the attic. I gave Lena a call down below, just checking things out up here. Lena remarked, "Did you get that door open?" when I got down. I hesitated just once before lying. "Not yet, no. The lock is more difficult than I had assumed." Although I felt guilty for lying to Lena, I had no idea how to convey what I had discovered. I needed time to try and make sense of it, to think. I developed fixation with the notebooks during the next few weeks. I would slip into the attic and read them every day Lena was at work. I began noting, looking for hints or trends that would help to explain their presence. I grew increasingly uneasy the more I read. It wasn't only the anachronisms upsetting things. The diaries included an amazing degree of information about the life of the writers and their surrounds. They knew knowledge they ought not to have been able to know. In one 1965 article, for instance, Sarah, the writer, detailed a chat her neighbors had in their bedroom. She is a woman. Though she could not have heard it, she transcribed the exchange word for word. Another entry from 1943 precisely foresaw the result of World War II with regard to specifics regarding the atomic bombs launched on Japan. Though it was yet 2 years in the future, Frank, the author, wrote about it as if it were known fact. Starting to lose sleep, I stayed up late into the night trying to make sense of it all. Lena observed that I seemed different. She would inquire whether I was all right, and I would dismiss her by stating I was simply under stress about my job. Actually, though, I was growing paranoid. I began to wonder whether our house was somehow incorrect, like it lived outside of conventional time and space. Though it sounds ridiculous, how else would you explain these notebooks? I also started to observe other oddities. I could swear occasionally that I heard voices emanating from vacant rooms. Once, while I was by myself in the house, I watched a shadow glide across the wall. Things started to seem even more weird around a month after I discovered the notes. One of the 1937 diaries I was reading included an entry that made my blood stop cold. The author, Victor, a male, penned, "Today's newcomers arrived from new neighbors. Young couples seem suitable. Tom is a male, Lena is a woman. Though they are not yet aware of it, once they start rumbling around the attic, they will be somewhat surprised." I dropped the notebook like it had scorched me. Thomas and Lena. Our names are. Still, this was composed in 1937, long before our birth. I turned the pages feverishly, searching for more references to us. I discovered many strewn around the diary. Victor wrote about our everyday schedules, our talks, even our emotions and ideas. Things he was unable to possibly know. Tom's been spending a lot of time in the attic lately, the latest note regarding us said. He has located the notebooks, I believe. Not a good man. He doesn't know what he has gotten himself into. Seeing how this turns out will be fascinating. My heart thumping, I slammed the journal closed. This couldn't be done. How would this Victor guy have known about us in 1937? And what did he mean by what he's got himself into? I knew I ought to let Lena know. I should show her the notebooks and walk through everything. But I got terrified, fearful of sounding insane, worried about what it could entail for us. I stayed silent, but my behavior grew increasingly random. Spending more and more time in the attic, reading and rereading the notes, searching for answers became second nature. Telling Lena it was for safety, I locked the attic door. I started to get jittery, always feeling as though I was under observation. Lena was truly concerned right now. She persisted in attempting to figure out what was wrong by chatting to me. 2 months or so after I discovered the notes, one night she confronted me. She remarked, "Tom, we need to talk," seated next to me on the couch. "Your behavior has been unusual for weeks now. You spend all of your time in the attic, you're not sleeping, and you're distant. What is happening?" I stared at her and sensed her anxiety. Though I was scared, I wanted to tell her everything. And supposing she disagreed with me? Imagine her thinking I was losing my sanity. I knew, though, I could not keep lying to her. With trembling voice, "Lena," I began, "there's something I need to show you." With hands shaking as I unlocked the door, I guided her up to the attic. I showed her the little door in the corner and then took out the notebook box. Watching her face go from uncertainty to skepticism to terror as I described what I had discovered and showed her the implausible entries. She said, turning through one of the diaries, "This cannot be real. How is this feasible?" "I am not sure," I said. "Still, there's more." Watching as her face turned pale, I showed her the entries on us. Her eyes wide with terror, she raised her head toward me. "Tom, we have to leave this house," she stated. "Right now?" I nodded as relief swept over me. These days I was not alone in this. We hurriedly packed a few belongings and headed off that evening, lodging checked across town. We started looking for a new location to live the following day. We never returned to the Maple Street house. We hired a business to arrange our stuff for our new place. I urged them to leave the attic unaltered. Our departure was 6 months ago. Though I can't get rid of the impression that we are still under observation, we are trying to get on with our lives. Sometimes I get flashes of dark figures out of the corner of my eye. Lena claims she dreams of the house, of voices murmuring from the walls. What those notebooks were or how they arrived in our attic is unknown. I'm not sure whether the Maple Street mansion is somehow outside of time or if we came across something incomprehensible. All I know is that there are things in this planet that shouldn't exist and that which defy logic, and occasionally it's best to turn away and not turn around. Late at night, though, when I can't sleep, I start to ponder about those notebooks. Still in the attic, are they? Has someone else come upon them? Most of all, though, I wonder, is someone, somewhere, currently writing about us in a diary that shouldn't exist? I discovered something in the study of my late father that is rewriting the course of history. I'd want to introduce myself to everyone. My name is Yakov, and I'd like to tell you a story that has been weighing heavily on my mind for the current few months. The fact that I am unable to provide an explanation for it is what has been keeping me awake at night. Despite the fact that I am not the most skilled storyteller, I will do my best to convey what took place. A little amount of history, it seems. During his time at the University of Chicago, my father, Anatoly, taught history to their students. At all times, he was captivated by the past. particularly the history of the Soviet Union, which is the country from where our family originates. He would dedicate a significant amount of time to his study, where he would pore over old books and documents in an effort to discover the truth about what had actually occurred during those times. Unfortunately, my father passed away unexpectedly a few months ago. Every single one of us was taken aback by it, but I was particularly affected by it. Having him as a mentor and guide has left a significant void in my life. He was my guide and mentor. In the aftermath of the funeral, I was given the responsibility of searching through his belongings, particularly his study. Considering that my father was not the most organized person in the world, it was a challenging task. It took me several weeks to sort through all of the heaps of books and papers that were stacked against the walls of his study. Something peculiar was discovered by me when I was going through this process. I was surprised to discover a small book with a leather binding that I had never seen before. It was hidden at the back of one of his desk shelves. Pages were yellowed and there was a musty odor giving it an ancient appearance. The words, which translates to the truth about the past, were written in gold-faded lettering on the cover of the book. Because I was curious, I decided to open the book and begin reading it. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than another one of my father's history texts, complete with names, dates, and events. On the other hand, as I continued to read, I became aware of something peculiar. Some of the incidents that were discussed in the book were ones that I had never heard of before. I had read certain history books, and according to those publications, there were events that had never taken place. At first, I was under the impression that it was either a simple error or that my father had discovered a very obscure historical record that had never been extensively disseminated among the general population. However, as I continued to read, I became increasingly aware that this was certainly not the same thing. This book was depicting a whole other version of history, one in which the Soviet Union had never been defeated and the Cold War had ended in a manner that was substantially different from how it actually occurred. Despite my fear, I couldn't help but be fascinated by it. My father had received this book from somewhere, and I had no idea what to make of it or where it had come from. I began to conduct some research in an effort to locate any reference to the events that were recounted in the book, but I was unsuccessful in my search. It was as though this alternative history had never been written down. Eventually, I became completely engrossed in the book, and I read it whenever I had the opportunity. In an effort to make sense of everything that was going on, I would remain up late into the night, reading through its pages. It was at that moment that I became aware of something that was even more peculiar. The novel was undergoing a transformation. At first, it was nothing more than a few minor issues. To put it another way, a date would be different, and a name would be spelled differently. At that point, however, entire passages began to shift, and they began to describe occurrences that I was certain had never occurred before. I had the impression that I was passing out. When I started to doubt all I understood about history, my father, and myself, I began to question everything I knew. Without a doubt, I had lost all sense of reality. Then, during the course of one night, something occurred that I am unable to explain. At the time, I was reading the book as I normally do in my father's study when I became aware of a noise coming from behind me. It was my father who was standing in the doorway when I turned around and saw him there. Nevertheless, it was not the father that I recalled. In addition to the fact that he was dressed in a costume that I had never seen before, he appeared to be younger, perhaps in his 32nd. A red star was embroidered on the cap of the Soviet military uniform that was worn. In addition to speaking in Russian, he grinned at me. The phrase, "I have acquired a book. You are my son, Yakov. The book was located by you. I was completely at a loss for words. Honestly, I was at a loss for words. I did nothing but stare at him, attempting to make sense of what I was contemplating. After walking up to me, he sat down in the chair that was adjacent to this one. He extracted the book from my grasp and proceeded to flick through the pages while nodding his head in agreement. "I knew you would find it eventually," he continued, switching to English instead of his own language. "I left it for you so that you would know the truth." "The truth about what?" I inquired after long last discovering my voice. He stated, "About everything in full. The past, the present, and the future are all topics that will be discussed. Yakov, this book is the key to understanding everything that has happened." Additionally, he went on to explain that the book was not merely a historical text, but rather a potent artifact that possessed the capacity to alter the very nature of reality itself. It had been handed down from generation to generation in our family, with each owner adding to its pages and molding history in the manner that they deemed appropriate. My question was, but why? Why would anyone want to change history? "Because sometimes the truth is too painful to bear," he explained to reporters. "Sometimes it's easier to create a new reality than to face the one we have." According to what he said with me, he had utilized the book in order to alter his own history, to erase the errors he had committed and the regrets he had carried with him throughout his entire life. And at this moment he was transferring it to me. He cautioned, "But be careful, Yakov," as he spoke. "Despite the fact that it is a powerful book, it is also harmful. What you do has repercussions, waves that travel through time and space, and every change you make has ramifications. Utilize it in a prudent and limited manner." After that, he disappeared as if he had never been there at all. He was as if he had suddenly vanished into thin air. I sat there for a considerable amount of time, attempting to make sense of what had just taken place. I looked down at the book that I was holding and felt its weight and the power that it possessed. There was a part of me that desired to make use of it, to alter the aspects of my life that I felt I should have changed, and to make the world a better place for myself and the people I loved. On the other hand, there was a part of me that was terrified of the repercussions and the responsibility that came along with having such power. In the end, I made the decision to conceal the book in order to ensure that it would remain secure until I could choose what I should do with it. After putting it back in the drawer exactly where I had discovered it, I made an effort to move on with my life. However, the novel continues to terrify me. Even when I am not in the same room as it, I'm able to physically sense its presence. It is calling out to me, luring me in with its assurances of a better future and a new history. I have no idea what I'm going to do with myself. It is difficult for me to determine whether or not I am capable of withstanding its attraction and bearing the burden of the truth that it carries. However, there is one thing that I am certain of. In the past, there is no set or unchangeable past. It is able to be altered, molded, and formed to conform to our preferences. On the other hand, that is a really terrible concept. That concludes my tale, if you will, for what it's worth. It is not reasonable for me to anticipate that you will believe me or comprehend the inconceivable things that I have witnessed and experienced. But in order to shed some light on this weight that I bear, I felt the need to tell someone. Additionally, if you ever find yourself in possession of a book similar to this one, a book that promises to alter the course of history and change the world, you should exercise caution. Mostly due to the fact that the ability to alter the past comes with a cost that might be too high to consider paying. But for the time being, I shall conceal the book and ensure that its secrets are kept secure. With the knowledge that the truth about the past is always just a page away, ready to be disclosed, I will make an effort to live my life to the fullest extent that I am capable of. I have been residing in the United States for almost 10 years at this point. The reason I came from South Korea was to pursue a degree in engineering, but I ended up staying for job instead. It has been around 3 years since I relocated to a modest apartment located on the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. There is a decent view of the city, and it is located in close proximity to my place of employment. Apartment 12B may be found at 3217 Nebraska 45th Street with the address. My concentration has always been on my profession, and I have always been a private person who prefers to keep to oneself. I never had a large number of friends, and my family is currently living in Korea, so I was the only person living in my small apartment. I had the impression that this was the case. Just about 6 months after I moved in, everything started to happen. I started to become aware of a few minor things that appeared strange. There were occasions when my mail would be a little bit out of position, or my door would be unlocked even though I was certain that I had locked it completely. In the beginning, I thought that these incidents were the consequence of my own forgetfulness, or that they were the result of a long day at work. Then, however, things began to become more serious. Whenever I returned home, I would discover that my stuff had been gently but noticeably rearranged. A picture frame that I had left on the coffee table would be slightly slanted, or a book that I had left on the coffee table would be on my desk. Despite the fact that it was unsettling, I was unable to pinpoint the reason behind it. I started to have the impression that someone was watching me. I would occasionally hear faint noises coming from the corridor outside my apartment when I was at home. These noises would come from the hallway. Even the sound of breathing may be heard, along with footsteps and the rustle of garments. On the other hand, whenever I peeked through the peephole, I never saw anyone there. One of my attempts was to justify it. There could have been nothing more than my neighbors arriving and going at strange hours. Alternately, it's possible that the structure was settling, that it was creaking and groaning like ancient structures do. Nevertheless, I had a feeling that something wasn't quite right. When I returned home from work one evening, I discovered that the door to my flat was slightly ajar. As I pushed it open, my heart was racing since I was anticipating discovering an intruder. However, there was no one in the flat, and there was complete silence. Although I investigated every room and every closet, I was unable to find anyone in any of them. It was at that moment that I became aware of the note that was sitting on the counter in my kitchen. A plain white piece of paper that had been folded in half was what it was. I opened it with trembling hands and read the lines that were written in red ink. "I'm always watching." I had a terrible feeling. This was being done by who? Why should it be me? Despite my contact to the authorities, they were unable to take any action because there was no evidence of a break-in. It was clear that they did not take the matter very seriously, despite the fact that they urged that I change my locks and be more careful. Despite the fact that I changed my locks, it did not help. The peculiar incidents persisted, making themselves more regular and more intrusive as time went on. In the closet, I would discover that my clothes had been reorganized, and in the bathroom, my toiletries had been relocated. There was a time when I discovered a garment belonging to a strange man hanging among my own, but when I went to confront my neighbors about it, nobody recognized it. After a while, I started to feel as though I was going insane. As a result of my jitteriness and paranoia, I was constantly checking behind me. Because I was embarrassed by the state of my apartment and my own developing nervousness, I stopped inviting the few friends I had over to my place. One day, I made the decision to take control of the situation on my own. I went out and purchased a covert camera, which I then placed in my living room with the lens looking in the direction of the entrance. Despite the fact that I didn't really anticipate catching anything, I felt the need to take action in order to regain a sense of control. After a few days had passed, there was no incident. I started to wonder if it was all in my brain, that the stress of working and living by myself had gotten to me. I was beginning to believe that it was all in my head. But then, one evening, as I was going over the film from the hidden camera, I came across something that caused my blood to become ice cold. It turned out to be a tall and slender man who was clothed in full black. The camera was the only thing he was looking at while he stood in my living room. While he was wearing a mask over his face, I was able to make out his eyes, which were dark and intense. This time, he was holding out a piece of paper that had the words "I know about the camera" written on it in the same red ink that he had used previously. I was unable to take a breath. How was he able to know, and what caused him to gain access? I had been extremely cautious, always locking my door and even placing a chair under the handle of the door when I went to bed. The man had already left by the time the police arrived, despite the fact that I had called them once again. For the purpose of gathering proof, they dusted for fingerprints and collected the tape from the camera, but I could sense that they were doubtful. The man had done nothing but stand there after all, and that was the extent of his actions. I was aware of this fact. This was not merely a joke or a misunderstanding on anyone's part. There was something ominous and maybe hazardous about this. I began the process of looking for a new place to live, but I was aware that those eyes were following me wherever I went. In the corner of my eye, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow, and in the street, I would hear footsteps coming from behind me. My eyes were continuously looking behind me, and I was jumping at every noise that I heard. When I returned home one day, I saw that my apartment had been completely trashed. I found my possessions strewn about the place, including overturned furniture, drawers that had been emptied, and other items. However, the wall in my bedroom was the most unpleasant aspect of the situation. At that location, there were photographs of me that covered almost the entire surface. I have photographs of myself where I work, when I shop for groceries, and even in my own residence. In addition, the words "You can't escape me" was scribbled in the same red ink and placed in the exact center of everything. At that moment, I was overcome with emotion and fell to the ground crying. I had no idea what to do or who to consult for assistance. I was afraid not only for my own safety but also for my own mental health. During that time, I discovered the box. A basic black box that I had never seen before was concealed beneath my bed. I had never seen it before. I opened it with shaky hands, and the contents that I discovered inside caused my heart to stop beating. It was crammed with various electronic surveillance devices. GPS trackers, cameras, and microphones are all included. There were also dozens of notes that detailed each and every one of my movements throughout the course of the previous 3 years. Everything from the time I left for work, to the items I purchased at the store, to the shows I watched on television. On the other hand, the photographs were the most repulsive element. I took pictures of myself through my windows while I was sleeping, while I was getting dressed, and while I was eating dinner. Over the course of several years, this someone, whoever they were, had been following me and violating every part of my privacy. I experienced feelings of being violated and exposed. I was unable to be in that apartment for even a single second longer. Without even pausing to lock the door behind me, I hurriedly gathered a few necessities into a bag and ran away into the night. As I made my way to the police station, I was holding the box of evidence in my hands with great force. This time they had a serious attitude toward me. They began an investigation, and with the assistance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they began to put together the identifier of the person who was stalking me. It was revealed that the individual in question was a man named John Simmons, who had previously worked as a security guard in my building many years before. Using his knowledge of the building's layout and security systems, he was able to obtain entrance to my flat and place the cameras. He had developed an unhealthy obsession with me. They discovered him in his own apartment, surrounded by further photographs of me and extensive notes on the activities I participate in on a daily basis. The depths of his addiction were scary, despite the fact that he had no prior criminal record and no history of perpetrating violent acts. Not long after that, I relocated back to Korea since I was unable to experience a sense of security in the nation that had been my home in the past. There are moments when I still have nightmares about those eyes watching me from the shadows, and another time when I hear that voice whispering, "I'm always watching." But I'm making an effort to move on with my life and start over. The events that transpired in my life are not my fault, and I am aware that there was nothing I could have done to prevent them from occurring. The thought that someone could infiltrate my life in such a way that was so pervasive and so stealthy continues to be a source of remorse for me. That concludes my tale, the tale of the one who remains hidden in the shadows. An obsession, a violation, and the loss of the one thing that we all take for granted, our privacy, are all elements that are explored in this narrative. And it serves as a warning that often the most scary monsters are the ones who are hiding in plain sight, the ones that we never see approaching until it is too late. It's been keeping me up at night. Maybe by jotting it down, I will at last find some quiet. It all began almost 3 months ago when I settled into my new Marietta, Georgia house. I am 28-year-old Yuki, a software developer newly hired by an Atlanta IT company. After years of living in a small apartment, I at last had enough money for a house thanks to my new employment. Finding this place at 145 Polk Street made me very happy. Built in the S, this older house had great charm and had been kept rather well. Before choosing to retire to Florida, the former occupants had lived there for more than 30 years. The first several weeks at the new house went really well. I was unpacking, organizing my home office, and adjusting to the lengthier drive to work. Everything seemed regular, and I was really glad I chose to purchase the house. Things got strange not until around 1 month after I moved in. It was Saturday morning, and I resolved to at last address the attic. I hadn't gone up there yet, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to check whether there was any additional room I might utilize. A little door in the upper hallway ceiling let one into the attic. Pulling down the folding ladder, I ascended and saw in the dark space using the flashlight on my phone. With sloping ceilings and a few little windows allowing in some light, the attic surprised me in size. Old boxes and furniture, shoved to one side, most likely left behind by the previous owners. My foot struck something firm on the floor as I was browsing. My flashlight pointed down, and I spotted a metal box roughly the size of a shoebox half buried in some old newspapers. Inquiring, I grabbed the box. It weighed more than I had anticipated. When I shook it softly, I could hear something rattling within. On the front, there was a tiny padlock, but it was opened already. Opening the top, not sure what I would find inside, my heart started racing a little, quicker. What I saw froze my blood. The box was loaded with multiple tiny cameras, wires, and little electronic tools. First, I considered if the former owner had had some sort of electronic hobby. Then I discovered, though, a folded piece of paper tucked under the side of the box. I unfolded it and read from shaking hands. Camera, master bedroom camera, guest bedroom camera, living room camera, kitchen camera, front door camera, backyard. I got queasy in my gut. These were not just haphazard gadgets, these were a list of covert cameras positioned all over the house. In my house. The residence I have been residing in for the past month. Trying to sort through what I had discovered, I sat there in the attic for what felt like hours. Was this perhaps some sort of joke? Had the past owners overlooked removing their security system? Deep down, though, I understood this was not typical security configuration. These were covert cameras positioned in private parts of the house. At last, I plucked up bravery to begin searching for the cameras. I started in my bedroom, the master bedroom. Before I came upon it, I searched carefully for almost half an hour. There, tucked behind the ceiling smoke detector, was a little camera lens. I never would have seen if I hadn't been really seeking it. Though my hands were trembling so severely I could not use my phone, I managed to call my friend Akira. Since college he has been my friend, I could count on him. "Hello Yuki, what's up?" Akira's voice sounded happy, totally oblivious of my own panic. "Akira, I need your assistance. Would you be kindly coming over? Like exactly right now?" I could hear the terror in my trembling voice. The other end stopped as well. "Yuki, you're good? You sound frightened." "I am. Uncertainty is great. I turned over something in the attic. I would want not to discuss it on the phone. Will you kindly come?" "Oh, sure, Guy. I'll arrive in 20 minutes. Just hang tight, okay?" My mind racing with options, I moved about the house waiting for Akira. Whose installation of these cameras here was still in observation, were they? Had they been observing me for the entire period? The idea exposed and violated me. I basically yanked Akira inside and locked the door behind him when he arrived. I have to have looked messy as his face turned worried right away. "Yuki, what's happening? You seem as though you have encountered a ghost." I inhaled deeply and worked to cool off. "Found something in the attic. Come on, I'll show you." Leading Akira up to the attic, I showed him the contents of the metal box. Glancing at the cameras and reading the list, his eyes grew wide. "Holy shit, Yuki. This is indeed quite disorganized." I nodded, a little relief at not overreacting. In my bedroom, I discovered one of the cameras. That comes from the smoke detector. I haven't yet looked for the others. Akira laid a hand on my shoulder. "All right, let us consider this. We have to locate every one of these cameras and take them down. We then have to find out whether they are still live and who might be viewing." The next several hours, we painstakingly searched every room in the house. We located all 6 cameras that the document stated. Behind air vents, in light fixtures, even within a phony electrical outlet, they were all quite well hidden. Those who had put things in place were experienced. I felt both relief and increasing rage as we took down every camera. By whom had this been done? Additionally, why? Sitting in my living room, the stack of cameras on the coffee table in front of us, Akira remarked, "We should call the police." I thought twice. And share with them what? That I came upon cameras in the house I recently purchased. Suppose they believe I placed them there? Akira nodded. "Yuki, here you are, the victim. These cameras before your arrival into this house. The cops have to be aware of this." Reluctantly, I consented. Akira then contacted the non-emergency police line. 2 policemen were at my door 2 hours later. After hearing our narrative, Officer Martinez and Officer Thompson looked over the cameras we had located. Officer Martinez stated, staring at the devices, "This is definitely concerning. You claimed to recently purchase this house?" I nod. About a month ago, before selling, the former occupants had spent more than 30 years living here. Officer Thompson was noting things. We would have to contact the former owners. Have you their contact details? I gave them the names and details gleaned from the sale. The cops promised to check and get back to me, leaving me with a case number and a business card to call should I remember anything further. They took the cameras and the metal box as proof. Akira insisted on spending the night even when the cops left. I appreciated the companionship. The idea of spending time alone in the house following what we had learned was horrifying. Akira posed the question that had been troubling me that evening as we sat in the living room with the TV on for background noise. What do you suppose they were viewing on the cameras? I shook. I don't know. Perhaps they were merely security-conscious paraffin. Why then, though, hide them like that? Akira nodded quietly. Indeed. And why would one place them in bedrooms? That is not what is typical security. We entered a tense stillness while each of us considered the worst scenarios. The next several days blurted together. At work, I couldn't concentrate. I was always wondering whether someone was still monitoring me or whether there were more cameras I had not located. Every little sound in the home made me leap, and I discovered I was always staring over my shoulder. 4 days following our discovery of the cameras, Officer Martinez called me. Mr. Tanaka, Officer Martinez is here. We would want you to come down to the station to discuss your case. We have made some development in yours. My heart sped. Did you learn who installed the cameras there? The other end stopped as well. It is difficult. We would much prefer talk about this personally. Could you perhaps visit this afternoon? I agreed and then phoned my supervisor to request the remainder of the day off. My thoughts racing with all kinds of possibilities, the trip to the police station seemed like it would take ever. I was escorted to a little conference room at the station where Officer Martinez was waiting alongside another man I did not know. Mr. Tanaka, thank you for showing up, Officer Martinez remarked. Detective Reeves here is this. He's been helping on your case. Noting the detective's serious expression, I shook hands with him. Please, have a seat, Detective Reeves said, pointing to a chair. We have some information about the cameras found in your home, but I want you to be advised this might be difficult to hear. Sitting down, my mouth went dry. Just tell me, though, would kindly. Officer Reeves nodded in detective fashion. We could follow the purchase of the camera equipment back to Harold Jenkins, the former owner of your residence. Mr. Jenkins first denied knowing about the cameras when we approached him. I had a flash of rage. Still, he placed them there, didn't he? Indeed, Detective Reeves answered. Mr. Jenkins told us he had installed cameras roughly 5 years ago after we pressed him. But the reason things gets really complex is here. Officer Martinez inclined forward. Mr. Tanaka, are you aware that 6 years ago a murder occurred in your neighborhood? I blinked, startled by the query. Not sure, I had no notion. Detective Reeves drew out and opened a file. 2 blocks from your house, 6 years ago, a young woman named Sarah Collins was killed in her house. The case cooled. We never identified the killer. I got shivers running down my back. What relates this to the cameras in my house? Mr. Jenkins developed obsession with the case, Detective Reeves said. He was persuaded the killer was still active and resided in the area. He set up the cameras not only to guard his own family, but also to attempt and record any strange activities in the neighborhood. I staggered back. He was then what, trying to be a detective? Officer Martinez agreed. Basically, yes. Though he says he never noticed anything strange, he left the cameras running for years in case. But why did he not remove them upon house sale? Still grappling with this material, I asked. Detective Reeves let out a sigh. He claims he forgot about them. He hadn't actively watched the cameras in years as they ran on a closed circuit, not connected to the internet. When he chose to sell the house, he basically ignored them. Essentially overwhelmed, I ran my hands through my hair. So what then occurs? Is he scheduled for arrest? We're still debating that with the district attorney, Officer Martinez remarked. Mr. Jenkins intended nothing evil, even though what he did was illegal. Still, we wanted you to know the truth about what we discovered in your house, independent of what happens to him. I came out of the police station numb. One may say that the absence of cameras in any current continuous plan eased me. It was nearly too much to handle, though, knowing that my house had been under surveillance for years and that the last owner had been frantically searching for a killer. I spent a lot of time just staring at the house while seated in my car in the driveway when I got home. Though it looked the same as it always has, now I knew its mysteries. I knew of the concealed eyes observing, of the paranoia seeping into its walls. I finally entered. The house felt different today, weighted with its past. Remembering where every camera had been concealed, I moved from room to room. I pictured Mr. Jenkins watching in the kitchen behind a vent, waiting for a killer who never materialized. A camera had been hidden there. I considered all the typical daily events that had been secretly filmed in the living room, where a camera had been concealed in a lamp fixture. That evening I decided, while I laid in bed unable to fall asleep, I left this house unable to remain. The knowledge of their existence, of the years of covert observation, was too much even when the cameras were gone. Once the house I had been so eager to purchase seemed contaminated. The following day I contacted a real estate agent. Knowing I would have to tell any possible buyers, I was direct about what had happened. The agent agreed to assist me in selling the house fast and was empathetic. The house sold 3 months later, and I suffered a large loss on the transaction. But I felt a great feeling of relief as I turned over the keys to the new owners, who understood the whole story and still wanted the house. I moved into a fresh, flat devoid of secret eyes peering from the walls or any buried past. Though my drive is longer and it's smaller than the house, I feel protected here. I can unwind without knowing continuously whether I am under observation. I still dream of the house on Polk Street occasionally. I wonder whether the current owners ever consider Mr. Jenkins viewing from the attic, waiting for a killer who never arrived, or whether they ever feel the residual presence of those secret cameras. Unaware of how near they were to being discovered by one man's obsession, I wonder if the true killer is still out there living in that peaceful neighborhood. Mostly, though, I consider how readily our sense of safety can be compromised, how our hometowns could conceal mysteries we never would have imagined. And every day I'm glad I discovered that metal box in the attic, since the discovery freed me free, even though it momentarily turned my life upside down. Free from invisible eyes, free from a house steeped in anxiety and fear. I am really alone now when I walk into my flat and shut the door behind me. And I will never take for granted the sense of privacy, of real solitude. The first home I ever purchased was in Boise, Idaho, and it was about a year ago. Despite the fact that it is a modest and older house located at 2112 West Jefferson Street, the price was reasonable and the neighborhood was pleasant and peaceful. Despite the fact that I spent a lot of time putting it together and making it seem like home, I was incredibly pleased with the purchase that I made. The decision to clear out the attic was made by me on a weekend. There was a lot of old trash that had been left up there by the previous owners, and I wanted to check to see if there was anything that was worth retaining. During the process of searching through the boxes, I came across an odd metal container that was concealed in the back corner of the room. The container was significant in weight, and it included a large lock that was rusted. I'm not the type of person who is known to be inquisitive, yet there was something about this container that piqued my interest. Unfortunately, I was unable to locate a key, despite my best efforts. After that, I went and fetched my toolbox, and using a hammer and a screwdriver, I was able to break the lock and unlock it. When I opened the container, I discovered a number of old papers within. My first impression was that they were nothing more than dull legal filings or something like that. Nevertheless, as I began to work my way through them, I became aware that they were, in fact, plans and maps of some type. The longer I looked at these papers, the more perplexed and concerned I became about some things. It was revealed that there was a complex network of tunnels and rooms that ran beneath the entire neighborhood. There were precise sketches of entrances that were concealed in secret places, such as people's basements, parks, and even beneath the street. I sat there in the attic for a considerable amount of time, intent on comprehending what it was that I was observing. This is the kind of thing that would be constructed, and for what reason? It was clear that these tunnels had been in existence for a very long period, because the dates that were written on some of the documents were from the 1960s and 1970s. What should I do? I was at a loss. Just putting the papers back where they belonged, locking the container, and forgetting that I had ever found it was a part of my desire. On the other hand, another part of me was aware that I couldn't blindly disregard something of this nature. Ultimately, I made the decision to give my friend Min-jun a call. I'm also from Korea, but he has lived in the United States for a longer period of time than I have. I had the impression that he might be aware of what to do. When Min-jun arrived, I showed him the documents, and his expression changed to one of intense concentration. "Jae-sung," he added, "this is extremely unfortunate. These tunnels, they have the potential to be hazardous. We spent a considerable amount of time discussing the options available to us. I wasn't entirely sure, but Min-jun was of the opinion that we should go to the police. Is it possible that they believed we were insane? What if, for example, we were caught breaking into the container and getting in trouble? Last but not least, we came to the conclusion that before we did anything else, we ought to make an effort to learn more about the tunnels. We made the decision to make an effort to locate one of the entrances that were depicted on the maps. After waiting until it was quite late that night, we made our way to the park that was close to my house in order to sneak out. After locating the location on the chart that indicated an entrance, we began digging beneath the surface. After a very long time, we were eventually successful in hitting anything metal. It turned out to be a trapdoor secreted beneath the dirt. We were successful in pulling it open, and once we did, we discovered a ladder that led down into the darkness. Min-jun and I exchanged glances with one another. Fear gripped us, but we knew we had no choice but to investigate what was under us. From the top of the ladder, we descended while using the flashlights on our phones to see. The passageway was cramped and damp, and the walls were made of rough concrete. It had a musty odor, similar to that of old books and damp soil. The distance that we covered appeared to take a very long time. The tunnel was winding and winding, and at times it split off in numerous ways depending on the circumstances. It was difficult to remember the route on the map while it was dark, but we made an effort to do so. Then we became aware of a sound. It was a sound that resembled footsteps, and it came from somewhere in front of us. Both Min-jun and I became ice cold. As we squeezed ourselves against the wall and barely breathed, we turned off our headlamps and covered our faces. Increasingly, the footsteps came closer and closer. I was also able to hear voices, people speaking in a language that I was unable to comprehend. In a harsh and hostile tone, it was said. Within a moment, a light suddenly materialized around the bend. There were shadows on the wall that were moving in our direction. Minjun grabbed my arm and we began to run in the opposite direction of where we had come from. While we were stumbling around in the dark, we ran as fast as we could. The footsteps were becoming quicker, and the voices were getting louder, and we could hear them coming from behind us. We were being pursued by them. At long last, we were able to spot the ladder that led up to the park. Our hearts were beating as we hurriedly climbed upon it. As we struggled to take a breath, we forced the door of the trap open and crawled out. Shuddering, we laid there in the grass for a while. Although the noises that were coming from the tunnel were still audible, they were much less audible now. After a few minutes, there was complete silence in the area. I went a considerable amount of time without saying anything to Minjun. We did nothing but sit there, attempting to make sense of what had taken place. Those individuals that were found in the tunnel, and what exactly were they doing at that location? Over the course of the subsequent few weeks, Minjun and I conducted additional study. We discovered old newspaper stories concerning the neighborhood, including cases of mysterious disappearances and crimes that have not been investigated. We began to speculate that the tunnels might be related to one another in some way. On the other hand, the more we discovered, the more terrified we were. We started to get the impression that we were being observed, as if someone was aware of what fresh information we had uncovered. In the middle of the night, I started to hear unusual noises coming from the basement. During his commute to work, Minjun had the impression that he was being followed. I returned home one evening to discover that someone had broken into my home. The fact that everything was moved around seemed to indicate that someone had been looking for something, but nothing was really stolen. My intuition told me that it had to be linked to the tunnels. I summoned Minjun, and he arrived at my location without delay. In my living room, we sat and deliberated on what course of action to take. Despite the fact that we were both afraid, we were aware that we could no longer maintain this secret. After then, we became aware of a sound coming from the basement. Ascending the stairs, footsteps can be heard. We exchanged horrified glances at each other, Minjun and I. They had located us. Although we made a mad dash for the front door, it refused to open. When viewed from the outside, it was locked. We were unable to escape. Increasingly, the footsteps were growing closer. We were able to hear voices that were harsh and aggressive. In preparation for the fight, Minjun grabbed a lantern. When I attempted to contact for assistance, I picked up my phone, but there was no service. Then they appeared at that location. There were 3 males. All of them were wearing dark attire and had masks on their faces. They were armed with firearms. "Where are the papers?" The demand was made by one of them in English with a strong accent. "Give them to us, and we won't hurt you." I was trembling so violently that I could hardly make a sound. In the end, I was able to state, "I do not possess them. I destroyed them." The individual laughed. "You are not telling the truth. You have been able to locate the maps. If you do not tell us where they are, your friend will perish." The gun was pointing in Minjun's direction. However, Minjun shook his head at me, despite the fact that I could see the terror in his eyes. I was unable to give in to his demands. I waited for the shot to come while I closed my eyes. However, it never appears. On the other hand, there was a tremendous crash, which was followed by the sound of glass breaking. The front window was shattered, and a large number of law enforcement officers were rushing into the room when I opened my eyes. The males who were armed with firearms made an attempt to flee, but they were immediately overpowered and placed in handcuffs. After more investigation, it became clear that Min Jun and I were not the only ones who had been looking into the tunnels. Since a number of suspicious actions had been reported, the police had been keeping a close eye on the neighborhood for a number of months. They were prepared to intervene since they had witnessed the men breaking into my residence and they had seen them. Our lives had been spared by them. It wasn't until the weeks that followed that the entire story was revealed. In the 1960s, a radical group that claimed that society was on the verge of collapse constructed the tunnels. They believed that such a collapse was imminent. They intended to use the tunnels as a means of moving throughout the city without being discovered, as well as for stockpiling weapons and supplies and for staging attacks. However, the organization had disintegrated before their intentions could be carried out, and the tunnels had been abandoned as a result. They had been neglected over the course of many years, until a new group came upon them and made the decision to exploit them for their own reasons. This new gang was a criminal organization that was involved in the sale of illegal drugs as well as the trafficking of people. Through the use of the tunnels, they had been moving their victims and their wares about the city, all the while keeping their activities hidden from everyone. When Min Jun and I had found the maps, we had unwittingly stumbled onto their operation. They had been keeping a close eye on us, attempting to determine the extent of our knowledge. In addition, once they understood that we had found one of their entrances, they made the decision to quiet us. It was a horrible event, and it is very likely that I will never forget it. But I am relieved that it took place in some way. With the help of Min Jun and me, the law enforcement officials were able to bring an extremely dangerous criminal organization to its knees and save a great number of victims. At this point, the tunnels have been completely sealed off and filled in with concrete to ensure that they will never be used again. Additionally, now that I am aware of what was taking place right beneath our feet, my neighborhood has a new vibe. There are times when I still have dreams about those dark, winding tunnels and the footsteps that are chasing us through the shadows. On the other hand, I am aware that we accomplished something significant, something that was significant. What took place is not something that Min Jun and I discuss very often. Both the anguish and the fear are too much to bear. But now we have a connection, a secret that we both know and that will always bind us together. And every time I walk by that location in the park, where the secret entrance used to be, I take a moment to reflect on how close we were to never coming out again. The fact that we are able to be courageous when it is required of us serves as a reminder of how precious life is. My story, which is about the tunnels that are located beneath 2112 West Jefferson Street, is now complete. It is a tale depicting both fear and bravery, as well as secrets and the truth. It is a tale that I will remember for the rest of my life, and I will cling to it.